to evolve as the US became more powerful. So between 1898 and 1965, the Monroe Doctrine was enforced through extensions like the Roosevelt Corollary, the Good Neighbor Policy, and the Truman Doctrine. Each of these policies affected the island of Puerto Rico. President Monroe's decision created the path for the US and Puerto Rico to cross. Those roads intersected in 1898, and their relationship changed with every evolution of the Monroe Doctrine. The work of American writers between 1898 and 1965 shows that as the United States altered its foreign policy in Latin America, the images of how Americans viewed Puerto Rico and its people changed alongside each shift in foreign policy. From 1898 to 1929, Puerto Rico was seen as a beacon of potential that could be shaped by American economic and cultural ideas of freedom that were antithetical to Spanish colonialism. Puerto Ricans, on the other hand, were viewed as lazy and backwards and who could only be redeemed if they adopted American customs. Between 1930 and 1946, Puerto Rico's image was that of a tropical paradise, and Puerto Ricans were praised for their European features. By the Cold War era, Puerto Rico was described as a capitalist economic miracle that was made possible by the US's resources and Puerto Ricans' hard work and American-like industriousness. So, Puerto Rico and the US's roads converged during the Spanish-American War of 1898. The Panic of 1893 economically ravaged the United States. Wounded Knee, Homestead, and tensions between genders and races defined the decade. Diplomatic historian Robert Albiesner said that the American morale was low enough in the 1890s that the United States needed to, quote, reaffirm American strength. The United States could thrash some other country in a war, or more subtly, demonstrate its ability to govern inferior peoples in an empire. President Theodore Roosevelt extended the Monroe Doctrine through the Roosevelt Corollary to make governing a Latin American territory possible, with the US serving as a massive guard with an even more massive gun. The US needed its morale to be boosted after several years of economic calamity. A war and claiming lands were looked at as remedies for this problem. When the Spanish-American War ended, the territories that the US acquired from Spain consisted of Guam, the Philippine Islands, and of course, Puerto Rico. Because of the United States' experience as a colony, Americans were not fond of the idea of imperialism. Actually, the country did not even consider itself an imperial power after claiming land from Spain. Instead, the US justified its newfound powerful presence in Latin America as an action that would cause Europe's foothold in the region to dwindle. The language used to justify the acquisition of overseas territory hailed the US as a helpful and beneficial force that could instill economic and governmental freedom to its neighbors. For the United States, freedom was the answer, and colonialism was a relic of the past. The Organic Act of 1900 in Puerto Rico is an example of the United States justifying its imperial pursuits. Once it was enacted, Puerto Rico gained a representative House of Delegates that ensured there was an American majority in the House and an American appointed governor. This hypocritical action was justified because the US communicated that this law would help civilize Puerto Rico, develop its economy, and undo Puerto Rico's past Spanish colonial ties. Puerto Rico was receiving a lesson on freedom, so to speak. American writers echoed the sentiments of this legislation as they described Puerto Rico and its people. These descriptions created images of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. In this case, members of the Young People's Missionary Movement of the United States, an organization of evangelical Christian missionaries, had the goal of civilizing and bringing God's prosperity to Puerto Rico. One of the organization's leaders, Howard Gross, wrote a book in 1909 titled Aliens or Americans, where he points to 4 problems that plague Puerto Rico. The first two were the tyranny of the Spanish Empire and the economic oppression of the people. The Catholic Church and the lack of education across the island were the following two problems. In essence, every problem that Gross noted was linked to the Spanish and their imperial practices. Spanish imperialism held Puerto Rico back from being self-dependent, according to Gross, and he deduced that Puerto Rico had the potential to become an economically prosperous island with an American helping hand that was not neglectful like that of Spain. Similar to Gross, an author named Charles H. Rector wrote a book in 1898 about Puerto Rico titled The Story of Beautiful Puerto Rico, Graphic Description of the Garden Spot of the World by Pen and Camera, which evaluated the island's economic potential. Topics included discussions on the land, the Puerto Rican people, and what ailed the island. He found that Puerto Rico's reliance on cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and coffee were crucial to the Puerto Rican economy. Before American occupation, Puerto Rico was hurt economically by high Spanish tariffs. Puerto Rican coffee and tobacco were not of better quality than its Brazilian and Cuban counterparts. Sugar cultivation was an industry in decline. Puerto Rico focused on the production of cane sugar, while other parts of the Caribbean cultivated beet sugar. Cane sugar yielded less than beet sugar and was more difficult to produce. With slavery abolished in Puerto Rico in 1873, there was no modern industrial infrastructure that could possibly help produce the same output as enslaved people were prior to 1873. Rector believed that with the help of the United States, Puerto Rico could obtain the infrastructure needed to increase production. He believed that with US intervention, Puerto Rico had the potential to double the sugar it exported. Rector's comments highlighted that Puerto Rico could improve with the United States' guidance. Puerto Ricans were viewed with similar promise despite their negative portrayal. Puerto Ricans were largely, at this period, viewed as exotic, backwards, and lazy. Although Americans saw Puerto Ricans in that light, they thought that the United States could redeem them. Rector thought that if Puerto Ricans were introduced to American ways, they could become good workers. He believed Puerto Ricans to be lazy, and his diagnosis was that laziness was linked to Spanish colonialism, which he believed kept Puerto Ricans in debt. The United States appeared to have a prescription for Puerto Rico's economic ills so that it could attain economic freedom. Since the Spanish had their own subjects in debt, Rector felt that the island lacked some of the qualities of the stalwart American type. And this condition consisted of the impossibility of ordinary Puerto Ricans having a say in their government, as he said. Their limitedness, as Rector described it, was the reason why Puerto Ricans were lazy, which was a characteristic that he was sure would be eradicated if the United States lent a hand to Puerto Rico so that they may rise by the work of their hand. An alliance between Puerto Rico and the United States could allow the island to spur into greater and remunerative activity. Puerto Ricans were expected to adopt American economic customs as well as cultural ones. Elizabeth and Richard Van Dusen published a children's short story in 1927 that implied that Puerto Ricans could engage with American traditions. Puerto Rican Snow was a short story that focused on the experience of two boys, one named William and the other Ricardo. William was from the United States. Ricardo was from Puerto Rico. In the story, Ricardo notices that William was upset and naturally, as a friend, asks him what's wrong. William said he was homesick, a feeling that had been intensifying because he could not fathom Christmas being 2 weeks away with no snowy hills to go sledding down. Ricardo tried to cheer him up and asked him to accompany him and his father to see the snow on the mountains of Al Bonito or Adjuntas. Of course, he was curious to see if Ricardo was bluffing. William joined Ricardo and his father on the trip, and he actually grew really pleasantly surprised. Not only was the weather cool and brisk, but Ricardo's father pointed towards some white matter on the side of the mountain that had William ecstatic. "Snow, snow, snow," William exclaimed. He even became euphoric once he got to go sledding down a hill. What William believed to be snow was not snow. The white matter on the mountains were white tarps that covered tobacco plants from getting scorched by the sun. William wanted to experience an American Christmas that he was familiar with, which is what Ricardo and his father helped him experience. This story holds Christmas as an American tradition. In Puerto Rico, Christmas Day is celebrated as it is in many other parts of the Caribbean and the Christian world. However, Puerto Ricans hold January's Three Kings Day as the pinnacle of the Christmas season. Therefore, the short story, Puerto Rican Snow, is actually not a story about a boy who misses snow. It is a story of a practice and holiday that Puerto Ricans can adopt alongside Three Kings Day to make them more American. 3 years after the publication of this short story, the world economy crashed and the Great Depression ensued. After 1929, the United States shifted its foreign policy in Latin America. The image of Puerto Rico and its people in the American imagination changed as well. The next evolution of the Monroe Doctrine began during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s. The good neighbor policy became the successor to the Roosevelt Corollary. In an effort to foster relationships in Latin America during World War II, FDR used the good neighbor policy to tackle the misconceptions of Latin America in the minds of Americans. FDR promised to stop intervening in Latin American countries while extending them respect, equality, and fraternity. To do that, the images of the United States' Latin American neighbors needed to be repaired after decades of damage. Puerto Rico's image was repaired through this initiative. This island was described as a tropical paradise because of its physical features, and Puerto Ricans were embraced for their white features. With the demand of cane sugar dropping precipitously during the Great Depression, the Puerto Rican economy sought to find another way to sustain itself. To do so, the economy looked to emulate other Caribbean islands like Cuba and Jamaica that had adopted tourism with fantastic results. Soon, writers like Van Dusen continued to play a role in creating images of Puerto Rico through their descriptions. In 1931, Van Dusen wrote Puerto Rico, a Caribbean Isle, which is a book that emphasized that Puerto Rico was, quote, not merely material riches, but embraces the idea of luxuriousness, of lavish beauty, of deep contentment, of slumberous peace, of constant pleasure, and plentiful harvest, unquote. Describing Puerto Rico as a place that is not materialistically rich is significant because he wrote of Puerto Rico's natural beauties as a commodity. Puerto Rico's prior image of being a land of problems was changing as